What you're seeing here is a spreadsheet of almost 4,400 composers' names, websites, and marginalized identities that the Institute for Composer Diversity sent out on September 17th, 2020. This screenshot was taken on March 29th, 2023. See that name in row 980 there? Yeah, that's my dead name. Hi, I'm Eris DeJarnett. My current pronouns are always in the description below, and I haven't been listed on ICD's Composer Diversity database since the fall of 2020. But earlier this year, I found out they kept my data. And it's been hanging out on an unsecured Google Sheet for 2.5 years. Now, I'm a composer, not a lawyer or a security researcher, but I am also a child of Silicon Valley. And when I realized I still had access to this spreadsheet, I knew that in order to get the exposed data taken down safely, I needed to figure out how to report the vulnerability to someone who could and would actually do something about it. Long story short, although I found the spreadsheet in March, I'm only just now talking about it because the workbook is no longer available, and I've had the chance to do some additional digging to try to learn more about ICD's data policies and consent model. Today, I'm going to outline the vulnerabilities I've found, what, as far as I'm aware, has been done about them, and what this means for marginalized composers who are currently in ICD's dataset, were in it pre-fall 2020, and folks who might be considering joining the dataset in 2023. If you'd rather read this, I'm also publishing an article on my website that you can go ahead and peruse for yourself. I will link that in the description below. But regardless of what format you're digesting this information in, I will be providing sources as often as I can throughout, so you can take that and get any supplementary information you might want or need. If you're up to speed on ICD's actions in and around 2020 and you want to skip some of that initial context, please feel free to jump ahead using the time codes. If this is your first time hearing about ICD in a remotely negative or maybe significantly negative light, though, keep watching and I'll run you through some big events. This is probably unsurprising to most of you, but this is far from my first rodeo with ICD. I can't tell you when my information first entered their database. In fact, I'm not even sure if I submitted it. But at some point prior to the summer of 2020, I was listed on the Composer Diversity database on ICD's website. I met director Rob Deemer in 2019 at the International Women's Brass Conference, where he presented a slideshow about their work and was actively recruiting volunteers to help with their ChamberWorks database. I offered up my email and agreed to be a data entry lackey, but by the time the effort got rolling, life had stacked a whole bunch of other things on my plate, and I couldn't really commit the time. The full duration of my actual volunteering is somewhere in the range of a couple of hours, but I mention it here because, like a lot of other musicians, I wanted ICD to do good work, and I wanted to believe that they would do good work. Unfortunately, that sentiment didn't last long. In the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, ICD tried to expand its online presence, and pretty soon after it started getting itself into hot water. Though most folks on staff at the time were plenty enthusiastic about the work they were doing, the Institute as a whole didn't seem to have many concrete policies on how they treated the composers in their care. Specifically, there were some pretty big discrepancies regarding when and how ICD did or didn't seek permission from composers to use their likeness and work on their social media accounts. Out of a deep respect for the artist who was at the center of the May 2020 firestorm, I am not going to go into detail here, but the important thing that you need to know is that in the spring of 2020, ICD was rightly called out for using this artist's name and likeness without consent. They offered what was, in my opinion, a pretty weak apology at the time, and in part due to community pushback, ICD began exploring shifting to an affirmative opt-in for composers in its database. And this is really important to make clear. Prior to September 2020, ICD did not require that all composers consent to being listed at all, or even confirm that their information was correct. In years previous, they had functionally absorbed several other small databases with similar aims, and at the same time, they were actively recruiting to get more additions to their own lists. As a result of not doing their own due diligence to confirm that composers were actively submitting their own information, and as a result of those early mergers, the ICD of 2020 contained massive amounts of unverified data, a great deal of which were aggregated without the knowledge or consent of living composers. As you may recall if you were watching the train wreck unfold, ICD spent the summer of 2020 doing a lot of damage control. Director Rob Diemer went on a podcast in June where he revealed the ICD website had gotten over 23,000 visitors that month alone. Social media posts about the database touted the over 4,000 composers listed at the time. For those of us who knew the opt-in was coming, those months were spent waiting for the email. I received it on September 17th, 2020, as part of a BCC that was sent to myself and who knows how many others. It read, "Dear composers, we are reaching out to confirm permission to list you in our online composer diversity database as part of the Institute for Composer Diversity. ICD is dedicated to the celebration, education, and advocacy of music created by composers from historically underrepresented groups through database resources and programming analysis. Our award-winning Composer Diversity Database allows users to discover over 4,000 composers of historically underrepresented genders, racial, ethnic, and cultural heritages, and sexual orientations. The public can search by composer name, living or deceased, common large and small ensemble genres, racial, ethnic, or cultural demographics, and by location, city, state, and country. Please check to confirm or correct your identity information listed by searching for your name using the Find function, Control-F on PC or Command-F on Mac. If all information is correct, please email us with your permission. If you need to make corrections, please list them in your reply to this email. Of course, you can also choose not to be listed in the database. Just let us know." Below this, there was a link. "If you have any issues accessing the Google Sheet, contact us and we will assist you. Thank you for your participation in this project." And it was signed by Alan Berquist, who at the time was the Composer Diversity Database Coordinator. I and many others searched for our names, checked our information, and did, or didn't, sign off on its use. I opted out, sending a lengthy email reply on September 20th, outlining my concerns regarding ICD's treatment of composers, Rob's unilateral decision-making, and unwillingness to learn from anyone with lived experience as a marginalized composer, and, you guessed it, data security. In my closing, I wrote, "My own entry is wildly out of date, but rather than correcting it, I'd like to be removed from your listings and databases in full." Days later, I published my reply to my website, along with a few additional thoughts about the Institute and its management. The next morning, I discovered it had gone viral among band director Facebook when the East Coast woke up, which was an adventure. The ensuing dialogue, which occurred over the course of a couple weeks, included a fantastic and comprehensive essay from anonymous members of the Tradewinds Ensemble, which is still accessible through the Wayback Machine and resulted in ICD announcing an internal review of Director Rob Diemer and the Institute's practices generally. The months-long wait for the review itself, and the consensus among many composers that this should have been an external review, spawned lots more great discussion. Most of this happened on social media, but if you're looking for something relatively condensed, I really enjoyed John Hong's I Care If You Listen article, The Institute for Composer Diversity, White Leadership, DEI Initiatives, and Ethical Advocacy. I'll link that below as well. I'm not going to go into detail about the internal review here because I wrote an analysis of it when it came out and published that. It's in 3 parts, still available on my website, and dives into depth on every point the reviewers made and covers a few that they didn't. But there are 3 big things you need to know. First, besides implementing the opt-in model, adding a few new fields to the form, and editing their website in a couple spots, most of the action items listed remain unfulfilled. Second, that ICD no longer lists the review on its website at all. And third, that they plagiarized both my writing and Tradewinds' document in their own review, lifting large passages of our work without attribution. I brought this to their attention after publishing my analysis, which also called it out quite publicly, and I was told it was rectified some weeks later, but as the review is no longer up on their website, I can't even show you that they didn't get all the attributions correct at the time. Thankfully, I have a PDF of the original, complete with the plagiarism, which is still available on my website if you would like to read the document. Even now, having written thousands of words about ICD's practices and advocating directly to them for years, I still second guess if I was clear enough about wanting myself taken off their site and out of their stuff, rather than just opting out to their use of my data. But that listings and databases in full part is pretty clear. And it's actually what I'd gone looking for while researching for a planned essay about ICD's privacy practices in 2023, believe it or not, when I stumbled upon that link they'd sent us all years ago. And do you ever look at something and go, there's no way they didn't take that down, right? Well, on March 24th, 2023, I did. And because it was ICD, I clicked anyway. And there it all was. As I started making a plan to report the exposed data to someone who could do something about it, there were a few questions that I found important to clarify. How available was this workbook? How old, roughly, was the data? How many people were affected? And, of course, who do I report this to? Some of these questions were fairly easy to find answers to, even as I was freaking out that so many people's identity data was sitting in my lap. I was able to assess the workbook's availability relatively easily by establishing two things. First, because the link had been sent to one of my vanilla Gmail accounts and didn't seem to require a login, I was relatively sure the workbook was set to anyone with the link can view. But to make sure of this, I also fired up Google Chrome, opened an incognito tab, and copy-pasted the link there. If my access had been somehow tied to my email address, this wouldn't have worked. Unfortunately for us, it did, meaning anyone on the entire internet with the link that I was sent could open the spreadsheet, regardless of any affiliation with ICD and any possibility of bad intentions. Thankfully, while it was egregiously unsecured, the workbook was relatively clearly labeled. If you look down in the bottom left corner, the title of this spreadsheet is ICD Master List 91620. Well, I think it would be reasonable to assume by that title alone that most of the data therein is from about that time period. We can actually get more specific. Why? Because my data is in there, nestled into row 980, and I still have all the timestamped emails. Let's remember, I received my opt-in request on September 17th, one day after the date listed on the workbook. I opted out on September 20th, asking to be removed from their listings and databases in full. That would include this one. The fact that my information remained on the unsecured spreadsheet as of March 2023 suggests to me this September 16th confirmation spreadsheet likely was never edited after that point. And if it was, those edits almost certainly happened between the 17th, when at least my opt-in request was sent, and the 20th, when I sent my response. Now, my name and website URL have also changed since then, but my ICD entry was still the same as it would have been in 2020, making it increasingly likely that nobody's touched this data since then. And this next tiny piece is more speculation and informed guesswork than anything else, but given the fact that my writing about ICD has gotten out there to such an extent that they once named me in a public apology, without my knowledge or any direct communication, I am at least somewhat on their radar. In fact, in October 2020, after publishing that apology to, I think at the time it was something like 8,000 Facebook followers, Rob Deemer emailed me himself to apologize for not sharing the apology with me before posting it. So even if I only register as mildly irritating to ICD, I am a very known quantity to them and their staff. They didn't bother to take my information off this spreadsheet, so I feel like it's a pretty good guess they didn't remove anyone else's either. So now the big question. How many people who are no longer listed on ICD's public-facing database had their identity information exposed? This is a question I can't nail down an exact number for, and that's because I absolutely expect ICD would immediately throw me under the nearest bus if there were any legal ramifications as a result of me sharing such a number. However, I was able to come to a very rough estimate using just a few things. A filter to weed out dead composers, the publicly available data from ICD's 2021 annual report, and the currently available composer diversity database, which, by the way, is downloadable in full by anyone visiting the site who submits a blank search form and then clicks download data. This is something ICD shares pretty freely when pitching its database to performers and educators. In fact, here's a 2020 video from the Next Festival of Emerging Artists YouTube channel, where director Rob Deemer explains and recommends the download feature.
You can always download that search, and you can come up with any number of different searches and then save each one of those searches as CSV files, which then will allow you to be able to open it up in Google Sheets or Excel, and then you've got that information.
I don't think I've ever seen ICD explicitly mention this downloadability in a disclaimer to the marginalized composers they list. While I'll be using it for non-standard purposes here, I thought it was important to make clear that access to the current database is something that they freely give out, and not something that I stumbled into, hacked, whatever. When comparing the two databases, we can achieve a general estimate of whose data ICD shouldn't have anymore by removing dead composers from both lists and subtracting out the number of composers who are currently listed still. Because we don't know who's entered or left the database in that intervening 2.5 years, this will establish a general range rather than any solid figure, but it is better than nothing. I'm going to be working with rounded values when discussing the 2020 spreadsheet in this section because there might have been errors or duplicates or other, technological artifacts of years gone by left in the document, and I don't know what does or doesn't apply because that's not something that I'm comfortable even speculating on. We're just going to keep it to nice round numbers so that way we can get a general sense and not fall into any potential pitfalls about trying to come to an exact value. After filtering out dead composers by excluding anyone marked deceased, I was left with roughly 3,600 presumed living composers in 2020 and 1,533 living composers in 2023. When you subtract those currently listed, you're left with approximately 2,067 presumed living marginalized composers who are no longer listed on ICD's public-facing database. And, again, this is a conservative estimate because it's incredibly likely that at least one composer has been listed for the first time between September 16th, 2020 and now. So let's use this as the bottom of our range, since it's fairly likely the number is higher than this. As I was reviewing my prior writing about ICD for this video, I noticed that in March 2021, I'd noted there were approximately 1,900 composers listed on the database. The Institute never actually told us when they were done re-inputting consenting composers, probably to avoid people doing this exact math, if I'm being honest. So while there's no way to know if this was the full amount of consenting composers, to establish a top end of our estimate, let's assume that it was. I didn't note the total number of dead composers at the time, but let's use the dead composers from the 2020 spreadsheet, since, hypothetically, they'd all still be listed in 2021. This would indicate there were approximately 1,123 living composers listed in 2021. Subtract that from the 2020 presumed living list, and we're left with an upper estimate of 2,477 marginalized composers no longer listed. ICD's own public numbers bear this estimate out pretty well. According to their 2021 annual report, as of January 2022, the composer diversity database included 1,438 living composers. If we subtract that from our 3,600 approximation in the pre-consent era, we can estimate approximately 2,162 living marginalized composers who were exposed on the 2020 spreadsheet, despite ICD not having active consent to have and use their information. Although this number leans slightly in favor of the low end of our estimated range, it is comfortably within it, and it's probably as close as we can come without year-over-year data being available. But regardless of where in our range the actual number falls, it's pretty clear that at least 2,000 living marginalized composers, over 40% of the original 4,000 plus composers ICD often used in their 2020 marketing, revoked or did not give their consent for the Institute to aggregate and use their data. Yet, ICD kept all that information until at least March of 2023. And, spoiler alert, they privatized the workbook, but I have no idea if they deleted any of the data. This is also the point where I should probably mention that it's actually workbooks, plural, because as I was getting ready to report the composers list, I took another quick pass through my emails, and I found another one. If you, like me, are a longtime purveyor of ICD's website and social media, you might be aware that although they have databases for orchestral, wind ensemble, choral, and art song repertoire, they have long promised but never published a ChamberWorks database to accompany these. In fact, Rob was recruiting for the Chamber database, which was then multiple projects, as long ago as 2019, when I met him after his presentation at the International Women's Brass Conference. In that fleeting period of time where I offered up my email to ICD's volunteer list, I was given access to the spreadsheet they were using to organize incoming chamber data. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in March of 2023, I still had access to that spreadsheet. In many ways, this workbook is a little less risky than the massive list of marginalized composers and their identities. It's much shorter, and at least based on my vague memory of the 2019 version, it looks as though non-consenting composers' works were generally removed or at least hidden. However, in a few spots, email addresses were plainly visible. Because of some surrounding context, I find it highly likely that this field recorded the email address of the person who submitted the information through a Google form, or perhaps the person who edited it later on. But regardless of why the emails ended up on the spreadsheet, the data being accessible through another totally unsecured link raised further concerns about ICD's data privacy practices. Perhaps most important among these, how many of their spreadsheets are like this? Armed with some basic estimates and a good chunk of surrounding context, I turned to the internet and recommendations from trusted InfoSec sources to figure out how to report this exposed data and who to report it to. As you might expect, ICD does not generally seem to enjoy my emails. And because this was a significant breach, I wanted to make sure that I could actually talk to someone. ICD doesn't list any staff as a point of contact for data security or privacy questions, and I had no inkling of who that would be within the organization itself. So I went to its parent, SUNY Fredonia. Unlike a good chunk of the big music diversity organizations in the classical music space, ICD is not a 501c3 nonprofit, but a division or some other child organization of the School of Music at SUNY Fredonia. For those asking why Fredonia, founder and director Rob Deemer teaches there, and they use the institute and its internships as a recruiting tool for composition undergrads. While ICD's lack of a board of directors does make accountability hard to come by, Fredonia has a couple of avenues by which I could try to get a hold of someone who would take this at least somewhat seriously. The first of these I explored, which was the most fruitful and actually got the workbooks privatized, was the SUNY Fredonia Information Security Office. After a short game of phone tag, I was able to get a hold of a helpful InfoSec professional who instructed me on how they preferred I make my report, and within days of my doing so, both spreadsheets had been secured. To give full credit where it's due, I was not watching this minute to minute, and it's possible that they were both secured within hours. Regardless, this was a good outcome because it meant that non-consenting composers no longer had their data exposed in this particular way. And before I get into what else I'd hoped would happen after that point, I want to take a minute to talk about the ramifications of the leak itself. One of the things I've been increasingly interested in over the past year and change is how the sometimes overwhelming pressure on marginalized composers to market our identities for performers and directors seeking diversity points can very easily conflict with our right to privacy. Well, the actual legal codification of this concept varies widely within the US and abroad. The right to privacy is an idea that underscores tons of important rights in the United States, including gay marriage, birth control, and until recently, abortion, just to name a few. Online privacy, though, is far less thoroughly legislated and litigated, and has been recognized in some jurisdictions as a right worth explicitly protecting. This often includes what is colloquially known as the right to be forgotten, or the right to have your personal data removed from companies' and organizations' datasets when certain qualifying conditions are met. California has instituted a pair of laws protecting this, the California Online Privacy Protection Act, which requires a site collecting personally identifiable information from Californians to conspicuously post its privacy policy on its website that must meet certain requirements, and the California Consumer Privacy Act, which deals more directly with the right to be forgotten. The European Union requires websites meeting certain requirements to comply with a law known as the GDPR, which enshrines the right to be forgotten, among other things. I'm not a lawyer, still, but I know those statutes are an important part of the online landscape, and I'm always a fan of folks understanding their rights, so if you live in either of these jurisdictions, these are definitely worth looking into. Though laws like these are important for compliance reasons, I'd argue that from an ethical standpoint, ICD has a responsibility to the marginalized composers in its care to handle their data safely and appropriately. It can, at its discretion, extend these rights to folks not in California or the EU. And doing this, including by providing a clearly laid out process for having data changed or removed entirely, is extra important due to the increased risk of harassment many marginalized composers incur simply by being open about our identities online. As I wrote to Fredonia's Information Security Office, a spreadsheet like this is a useful tool for any bad actor who may wish to surveil, dox, or harass either one or many of the marginalized composers listed therein, especially in a time when state legislatures across the United States and some governments abroad are actively working to criminalize, for example, trans people who make music in public, among other things. Though it's likely relatively few of these composers are trans, all of us, by virtue of being marginalized, are at increased risk of online and real-world harassment. And when an organization like ICD solicits our data for aggregation, they are responsible for handling it appropriately, including secure storage and disposal. I have composer friends, including some who are or have been listed on ICD's website, who have received death threats simply for advocating for a world that allows them the same access and influence as our allocishet dyadic abled white male counterparts. As composers in the 21st century, we are all almost required to be contactable through the internet, and trolls find many of us without any help. Carelessly stored massive lists of marginalized people and their professional websites only exacerbate that risk, especially when we aren't aware our information is available through that organization at all. In a twist that would be funny if it weren't so depressing, ICD appears to be aware of the importance of proper data storage and security. On their donations page, run by their fiscal sponsor, the Fredonia College Foundation, they explicitly state that they need funds to improve their cybersecurity and data storage. While I haven't seen ICD's financials, publicly available information proves they've amassed a pretty good chunk of change over the last 4 years. A little over $11,000 from this Indiegogo campaign in 2019, almost $16,000 through their spring donations drive in 2020, $100,000 from the Sphinx Venture Fund at the end of 2020, and an undefined number of JW Pepper MyScore memberships that today would be valued at $100 each. ICD's own 2021 annual report, the only annual report they've put out, by the way, lists their numbers somewhat higher. Though the 2019 total matches, their 2020 earnings total $23,121.80, and their 2021 income is listed as $101,423. If we believe their numbers, they've made at least $135,670.80, plus a bunch of memberships to a publishing service since 2019. And despite all that funding and all the time that's elapsed since, they clearly haven't invested in robust online infrastructure services that would ensure the security of their dataset. Or at least, maybe, keep it from hanging out in the open. In fact, if you use the 2021 annual report to compare their income with their administrative expenses over that same 3-year period, ICD appears to have had a ton of extra cash on hand at the beginning of 2022. At the time the 2021 annual report was released, if those numbers are complete, ICD would have had $102,150.74 in available funding, over 3 times what they'd spent on 3 years' worth of administrative expenses. Yes, the vast majority of that was grant funding and likely allocated, but given ICD was awarded that $100,000 to fund the ICD database expansion and community impact initiative, a project aimed at building up Black and Latina composers' works listed on the ICD website, you'd think the good folks at the Sphinx Venture Fund would probably be okay with them using part of that money to make sure the back-end data on those Black and Latina composers was kept secure. And especially given that ICD's Winter 2022 Research Fellows description, which they're still using as of June 2023, only offers those fellows a measly $10 an hour wage for their labor, there definitely appears to be a lot of funding whose final destination is completely unknown. If ICD doesn't pay research fellows anywhere near a living wage for their time and labor, and hasn't invested in the security of their data, where are they spending that money? The Institute has long been open about the possibility of starting an endowment, but you'd think they'd focus on paying laborers fairly and making sure their back end actually works before chucking gobs of money into savings. An institution with an endowment absolutely should not be waffling about notifying those affected of a breach in their dataset, especially when some of those affected may not have ever known ICD had their data to begin with. And if I'm being real here, when you say you won't use composers' data without their consent anymore, you should be deleting it when you get an opt-out. Part of why I yanked my information off their database, to the extent that I thought I did, was because there was no clear commitment to updating composers' identity information in a timely manner. We never heard anything more specific than, yeah, we should do that. And certainly no plan or disclosure that outlined exactly how fast they could or couldn't make changes and removals happen. Yes, this is a mostly volunteer organization, and yes, the time they spend on the Institute is spent away from their own lives and families, but that doesn't negate the responsibility they bear for properly tending and presenting our data. Particularly in an era where entire states are banning mentions of queer people and identity-based affinity groups in schools, an organization that purports to do the amount of good that ICD claims it does absolutely has an ethical obligation to put its composers' agency ahead of its institutional goals and marketing. After I reported the leak and the workbooks were secured, I fully expected Fredonia, or ICD by itself, to notify everyone whose data was exposed that their data had been exposed. It's an incredibly common step when rectifying a vulnerability that allows those affected to be fully aware of any additional risk they might have incurred in the period of time that their data was exposed. This heads up would enable folks to tighten their privacy settings on their social media, edit their websites, check on data in other organizations' data sets, and any other additional steps that individuals may deem necessary. Well, I also personally wanted that follow-up to include information on where affected composers can stay apprised of ICD's investigation into their own data practices, assuming such a thing was going to occur. I'd still be at least somewhat happy to see any notification at all. This would probably include a public post on their website and socials, since they likely didn't have contact information for every composer whose data they scraped off the far reaches of the World Wide Web. But these things take time, especially when there are 4,000 or more people's information in play. So I waited. And waited. And waited. Roughly a month after I made the initial report, I followed up with the Information Security Office asking when we would see such a notification, since I hadn't received one at either the email address that they'd sent my opt-in request to in 2020 or at the email address I had used to report the problem in 2023. I received a reply stating the university is currently investigating this matter, and the next day, on April 26th, I got a follow-up that simply said they have fully investigated that issue and have responded accordingly based on the results of that investigation. No further detail was given, the ticket was closed, and when I inquired again about when we'd be notified, there was no response. Still, SUNY Fredonia is a pretty big institution, and someone's got to be overseeing ICD. Right? If ICD were a nonprofit, this is when I'd be tracking down their GuideStar page and talking to their board of directors, but in this case, those don't exist. However, ICD markets itself as a research institution and solicits data from living composers, not all of which is listed publicly on our websites. So there's a decent chance they'd need to get human subjects research approval from Fredonia in order to do this work at all. I looked up Fredonia's version of an IRB. They call it the Human Subjects Review Committee. And I spent some time researching what I might be able to learn from someone overseeing ICD's research. Now, the cataloging of marginalized composers is admittedly a bit of a gray area in the world of is this human subjects research or not, mostly because as far as the Department of Health and Human Services is concerned, research has a fairly narrow definition, and some projects are able to slip through the cracks without being fully out of compliance. As HHS is probably mostly concerned with research involving medical information, this isn't totally a surprise. IRBs aren't necessarily set up to grapple with this organization wants to list our identities and fundraise off the size of its database, even though it doesn't actually direct any funds to the marginalized composers in its database. But universities have the power to say, hey, all research projects need to be vetted to either meet compliance standards or receive a waiver. And theoretically, fortunately for us, Fredonia does set that requirement forth in its standards for institutional research. This means that someone somewhere has reviewed ICD's research proposal annually and either required it to meet certain compliance standards, including those regarding data security, or issued it a waiver. And hypothetically, someone within that group should be a point of contact for those with questions regarding ICD's research methods, including the subjects of its research. After digging into Fredonia's available materials regarding project review and approval, I sent a couple emails inquiring as to if ICD had an HSRC point of contact who I could ask about its practices. I was bounced around a couple of email addresses as I clarified my questions until eventually I was deposited via CC at 2 Fredonia professors and administrators who my previous correspondent indicated would be answering my questions. I'm trying to keep these general and easy to answer. Things like, does ICD use informed consent or blanket consent, or neither? And can I get a copy of ICD's data and privacy policies? And if they don't exist, can you tell me why? These ideally would be easily answerable with links, attachments, or short responses. And yet, despite starting this search in early April, I am still without answers as of mid-June. As an adjunct myself, I'm sure this wasn't the highest priority for Fredonia's folks relatively late in their term. But when one of your institute's research projects has leaked over 4,000 people's information for 2.5 years, responding sometime within the semester it happened feels rather important. So, I'm always happy to send reminder pings, but after a month and then more, it pretty solidly felt like nobody was going to answer those questions at all. So, at this point, I've reached a bit of a dead end with information security and a bit of a dead end with human subjects. Slightly unsurprisingly, the administrators I've spoken to along the way seem to regard this as a minor issue and not one that could have legal ramifications for, say, a queer composer in Tennessee or Florida who works in or around a school. And after working on this in my spare time for going on 2 months now, going on 3 months now, a long time, I've exhausted my belief that if I find the right institutional channels to go through, the people who are supposed to give me information due to my status as a former research subject will actually do so. That means it's time to bite the bullet, write an email to Rob and his team, as well as a few other staff at Fredonia I have yet to knock on the doors of, and ask ICD for their version of the story. Greetings from Eris of the future. At this point, the request for comment that I sent has been out for a couple of days. I decided to give them the weekend to think about it and get back to me if they were so inclined. However, I wanted to just briefly summarize what exactly I sent them and where I sent it. As much as virtually no one in this process has been interested in answering my questions, part of me still holds out at least a little hope that someone, somewhere associated with this mess can at least provide a definitive point of contact for those who've been listed in the database in the past and those who are currently listed now to understand our rights and actually find out what all of the ICD and Fredonia policies governing the use of our data are. So that way we can all make informed choices about what we do or don't want done. To maximize my chances of success, I sent this to several people. First, probably, obviously, Rob Deemer, director and founder of the Institute for Composer Diversity, and I also sent it to 2 other emails at ICD as well. info@composerdiversity.com, which covers a whole bunch of folks. I think about half a dozen people have access to that email address, and Composer Database at composerdiversity.com, which handles more directly some of the database stuff. I also copied Dr. David Stringham, who I believe is the incoming dean of the Fredonia School of Music. I'm a little sorry, but I wouldn't have had to send this to you if everyone I've been trying to reach previously had answered any of my emails. And I also sent it to SUNY Fredonia's campus media contact, which is the closest thing I could find to PR person. I'm not necessarily sure that any of these are going to get me replies, and as I said, so far it's been crickets, but I figured try to get a good spread so we can figure out if somebody from one corner of the ecosystem or another wants to talk to us and answer our questions. You'll notice I did not include information security or human subjects on that list. Because I've tried to talk to them so extensively, I decided that I would skip that for the time being, though if I do get a response, I think it is reasonably likely that I could be referred back to them again, although at that point, hopefully that would be someone going, these are your points of contact, and then I can tell you that. Along with some general background information about the exposed data and ICD's opt-in transition for a lot of the folks on the email who were not around for that time period, I decided to ask for comment on ICD's security practices, any planned responses to the breach that's currently planned, not we are planning in response to your email, and its ethical obligations to the composers in its care, basically like a lot of the big questions that I and many other people have been asking for going on 3 years now. Beyond that general prompt, I'm also including a short for me list of specific questions that I would like their comment on if they are so inclined. Listen, I'll put them all up on the screen for you, but I'm just going to summarize some of the greatest hits orally because there were 14 of them. Yes, this was the short list. So greatest hits include basically what actions were taken and what was found after the spreadsheets were identified in March. When will composers be notified if their data was exposed and how? If they're not notifying us, who can we contact to find out if our data was on an exposed spreadsheet? And will we be able to access our individual entries recorded on that spreadsheet so we can also verify if incorrect or out-of-date info was exposed? Are there data policies, privacy policies, or terms of service available both for ICD site visitors and composers whose information is in their data set, even if they have never visited the site? And where can we find those? Is ICD required to hand over its entire dataset if subpoenaed in a connection with a civil or criminal case? Spoiler alert, the answer to this question is almost universally yes, but getting people to say it to you, to your face, can sometimes be rather tricky. Where on their website can composers revoke their consent and have their data removed? How completely are they able to delete their data? Are they subject to standards for human subjects research? Does the School of Music believe ICD's data practices as of March 29th, 2023 are sufficiently high quality? And if not, what steps are being taken at an institutional level to realign those with the School of Music's and/or SUNY Fredonia's standards? There's a lot of questions there that span a relatively wide range of things related to this issue. You'll note I did not get into what kind of consent do they use, what kind of, specific things like that. I would love answers to those questions, but if I have one shot to get any answers from people, I'm not going to prioritize those. I would much rather hear, when are we going to hear from you about this? Which We still may not. We'll see. I sent the email on Thursday. I am giving them until Monday, mid-afternoon Monday for them to get back to me. And then I am going to finish this video and export this video and post this video. And wow, is that a surreal sentence after almost 3 months? As we're sitting here waiting for comment, it is very possible that I won't hear from them, or we will get very little. We may even get they might do the putting out a statement on their Facebook right as the deadline is elapsing. I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me given what I've seen from them in the past. But as usual, there are a few ways for us to make our voices heard and use our collective energy to get things moving, hopefully, or at least pressure them so they know that we expect them to get things moving, which might be the best that we can do for now. So here are a few quick thoughts on that. If you used to be listed on ICD or might have been listed on ICD and you aren't sure, or even if you know you were listed and still are and want to know about if your data was exposed or not, we don't have a listed security contact for ICD, as I mentioned previously, so it's probably best to hit up Rob Deemer as the person who theoretically has the most permissions. The Institute lists his email address on their website. Here it is. All of this stuff is going to be in my blog post as well, so if you want to go back and read it and not listen to me say it to you all again, it's down there. If you would like to inquire within Fredonia, you can try the Information Security Office if you want to, but you should know that using the email address they have listed just puts you straight into their ticket system, and they don't actually have to accept or really open your ticket. They can just ignore it. So that may not work for you. They do have a phone number that's listed on their webpage. If you want to bug more people at ICD, the Composer database email address might be the best one. You can also try info@Composer Diversity, and both of these I requested comment from, so theoretically it should not be immensely surprising to them that you were coming. For information about your rights as someone who has been listed or may have been listed, the Human Subjects Research Committee is supposed to be the people who will tell you about your rights, but they don't really enjoy answering emails, it seems, which I understand. If you yourself are attached to an institution, you might be better off talking to your own IRB and trying to get a general sense for what kinds of things you might be looking at, because I'm not totally sure we're going to get guidance from Fredonia, even though, again, we should. I'd also recommend, if you are a composer or any kind of musical creator who might have been listed, or know you were, I would recommend checking your email. And any email that you have access to that you've used professionally for that past 5-ish years or so, look for a message sent in September 2020 with the subject line, Institute for Composer Diversity listing. If you have that email, you have the link that worked. And theoretically, that means you were on the spreadsheet. You might also look for an email in or around November 2020 with the subject line Institute for Composer Diversity Updated Composer Profile, and then in brackets, response requested. This was a follow-up sent later that should only have your particular entry details in it. I also got this one, and I also mentioned when I was doing the review that that might mean they still had our data. Shocker. But if you got either of these, you should probably assume that your information was shared. And if you have the second one, you can see what they had at the time. If you have the first one, you probably can't. Either way, it would help you narrow down that you were on that spreadsheet, most likely. If you also have a professional website that you have access to your traffic data for from previous years, check prior to about November 2020. If you got any referrals, if people were directed to your site from composerdiversity.com/literally anything, you should assume that you were on ICD's database, and or somewhere on their website there was a link to yours. None of this is here is a fail-safe thing, but this is as close as I can get you without ICD taking responsibility and doing the right thing. Whether you are someone who might have been on the list or not, if you care about ICD protecting and appropriately handling its composers' data, you should definitely tell them that, because clearly they need to be told. You can email any of the email addresses we've already covered. I will try to put them somewhere. And if email isn't your thing, they are on social media. They have Facebook and Instagram that they use at least somewhat regularly, so you can definitely try them there. And as we are aware from historical precedent, one of the other super effective ways to get to ICD is by going on social media and talking about them very loudly. If you don't want to share my video, that is completely fine. Like, you do you and communicate however you want. However you do that, remember that making clear asks can sometimes be helpful and effective. You can decide what those asks are. If they're, we expect a data deletion policy and a privacy policy that we already should have by some date that you think is appropriate. If it's, we want published findings of any and all investigations into this issue and we want to see the results and all of that. If it's, we want actual accountability in X, Y, or Z way that you can articulate. If it's, I want someone to step down. If it's, I don't want this to exist anymore. If it's, I don't think anything should happen to them, but they should be ashamed of themselves. Like, that's completely up to you. Having some of those things, if something comes to mind that feels right for you, can be really effective. ICD has long had this executive advisory council that they don't seem to actually use much. They're all listed on their website. I will link that as well. If you know someone on there and you're comfortable doing so, consider reaching out and at least like making sure they know what's going on, because I don't know that they're going to find out otherwise. And if, you know, your relationship is such that you feel comfortable, consider asking them if they're really cool co-signing an organization that treats composer data like this. And obviously, you can express your concerns straight to SUNY Fredonia. You can reach the incoming dean at the email address I will put down there. All of this stuff is going to be listed in more detail on my blog. But assuming that I have enough characters in the description, I will try to include most of that stuff down there as well. You should keep in mind, if you're talking to Fredonia, that ICD is used as a marketing tool to get them composition undergrads. It's on their front page of the comp program. That is not a small thing, and you should ask them, if you are so inclined, if these practices are reflective of how they want their students treating other people and other people's information in the professional world. If you want to try to help marginalized composers who might not know that their data was exposed, just check in with your friends. Other marginalized composers, I'm really sorry that I'm saying this because some of you are going to get like 60 pings. I'm so sorry. I would have loved to personally get a hold of all of you and let you know, but that was not something that I'm comfortable doing for potential legal reasons, because who knows what would happen. Use whatever methods work for you. You know, but check in with people, at least make sure that this is on folks' radars if you think that they would have been active at the time and might have been on the database. And if you were or are in California or the EU, generally I would really recommend reading up on CalAPA, CCPA, and for the EU folks, the GDPR, and understanding what extent of that you might be entitled to in whatever situations, right? Some of it only applies to people who sell your data. Some of it only applies to sites that meet certain requirements as far as the size of the business or whatever. It's not necessarily super straightforward, cut and dried. I recommend knowing your rights generally, and that way you have that in your back pocket for all of your online dealings, not just this one. Remember, even though ICD may look too small to be bound by some of these ones with size requirements, they are part of Fredonia, which is much, much bigger. I am not a lawyer. I am just a nerd. We don't have clear answers. We don't have hardly any answers, if I'm being completely honest. And again, we have the Institute of Composer Diversity really, really trying hard not to admit that it does not take very good care of its composers. We have seen this before, several times. Regardless of what you do or don't take with you from all of this, I do hope that, bare minimum, you're thinking about what it means to treat composers and their identities with the respect and dignity we deserve. Because this is an organization who has raked in literally over $100,000 of funding, and we don't know their 2022 or 2023 numbers either. They have partnered with the Midwest Clinic. They are being elevated to some of the biggest stages especially in the wind band and music education world. They are doing it on our data. And they started on our data. Even those of us who are no longer listed. Part of how they made their name was that over 4,000 composers thing that they pushed real hard. That's our data. And they're the ones who are reaping a lot of those benefits. They get to go to those concerts. They get to be seen as authorities on these things. We don't, generally. Where we have to go and, like carve our own paths out. And we're the ones living it, Yeah, the leadership's a little less white than it was in 2020. But this is still an organization that does not do a very good job in analyzing multiple axes of oppression in any direction. And they're really not good at keeping promises, especially those related to transparency and correcting past mistakes. Just why I've been very cautious going into this. But it is important nonetheless that we talk about it. Because this stuff is hard, and it's hard on us. Yeah, they're going to have a bad day, maybe a bad week. But if our information got exploited, that could be very bad for us for a long time. Especially for our Black and Indigenous colleagues, who tend to bear the brunt of that more often than not. They deserve so much better. And we can be part of nudging and poking and irritating them until they decide to do better because they have not responded to gentler prompting. I don't know, folks. I have so many more things that I could say, but this video is already very long. After the deadline closes, I'm going to film one more clip that lets you know about did they answer or not? And if I need to film other things, if they've commented on specific things that I should insert earlier in the video, I will do that, and you'll probably have already seen those if they exist. And then this goes out. It'll be in more of our hands now. And that, at least, I feel really good about. Because I believe in us the most. Hi, everybody. It's about to get real hot in here, so I'm just trying to take advantage of the light while I have it, and then I'm going to shut my windows. But I can now confirm that both SUNY Fredonia and the Institute for Composer Diversity declined multiple requests for comment. I followed up with ICD on Saturday and submitted the same message I'd sent through email through their online contact form, and I re-upped the entire email to all parties on Sunday night, just as a last reminder in case they had something cooking that had not yet been sent. But no replies on the whole, so it looks like this is what we've got. And so I guess here goes nothing, I've been working on this since March. I'm really excited to finally put it in your hands. Not excited it happened, but I'm glad that finally y'all will get to know. So I'll catch you out there. Take care, everybody.